The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, is one of the most secretive groups in the United States federal government. Some call them the company or the agency. They call themselves the nation's first line of defense. However, as much as the CIA is known for counterterrorism or intelligence gathering, it's also been responsible for its fair share of scandals and horrors since the agency's establishment in 1947. From staging coups in foreign countries and targeting political dissidents on American soil, to collaborating with the Nazis and backing war criminals, these are some of the evilest things the CIA has gotten away with it. The CIA has drawn scrutiny since its founding for its repeated meddling in the governments of nations in the global south. One of the most shameful examples is the CIA's involvement in the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat that deposed Jacobo Arbenz, the democratically elected president of Guatemala, and installed the military dictatorship of Carlos Castillo. This marked the beginning of a trend that saw a series of authoritarian rulers in Guatemala who gained power with backing from the United States and the CIA. The CIA operation involved a combination of Cold War-era fears of communism and banana-based corporate interests. Arbenz was elected in 1950 in a series of elections across Guatemala. His ties to the communist movement alarmed the American authorities, but Arbenz's actions as president were largely focused on workers' rights and agricultural reform, rather than an attempt to establish a communist state. Still, his agricultural reforms, which transferred the ownership of uncultivated land from larger landowners to poor farmers, drew negative attention from the United Fruit Company, which had a vested interest in maintaining a monopoly on Guatemalan land. The company lost uncultivated land to the agrarian reform laws passed under this new administration and turned to the U.S. government for help. They lobbied the U.S. government and began a public relations campaign to discredit the new Guatemalan government. Between the pressure from the United Fruit Company and the steadily increasing fears of communism due to the tensions of the Cold War, the U.S. government became more and more suspicious of Guatemala. In April 1952, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, the dictator of Nicaragua, told President Truman and his senior staff that if the USA provided him with weapons, he would, quote, clean up Guatemala. Shortly after this meeting, the CIA reached out to an exiled Guatemalan military officer, Carlos Castillo Armas, and provided him with weapons and $225,000 of additional aid so he could plan and carry out a coup. Over the next few weeks, the CIA, the UFC, and Garcia worked together to plan the coup. The CIA also contacted and collaborated with the US-backed dictators Marco Pérez Jiménez of Venezuela and Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic. The CIA's plan included the assassination of 58 Guatemalans and the arrest of many more. In late 1952, the plan was set into motion. A UFC-loaned freighter was refitted and filled with weapons, then sent to Nicaragua. However, this portion of the plan was unsuccessful, and the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, called it off. But the Guatemalan coup was not yet dead in the water. The CIA continued to pay Castillo Armas on a monthly basis and provide him with the resources needed to maintain a small army. In August 1953, President Eisenhower announced a CIA operation to overthrow President Arbenz, codenamed Operation PB Success. The plan for this operation included recruiting Guatemalan exiles and men from nearby countries, as well as a guide to those who would be assassinated in the event of the coup's success. On June 18, 1954, Armas's forces invaded Guatemala, accompanied by air bombings of Guatemala City and a naval blockade. After an unsuccessful attempt to fight back, Arbenz resigned on June 27. 10 days later, Armas was president. Castillo Armas proceeded to round up thousands of opposition leaders and arrest them, repeal the Constitution of 1945, and give himself nearly unlimited power. When the jails became too full, he built concentration camps to hold his excess prisoners. When citizens attempted to flee the country, Armas took advice of the CIA head Allen Dulles and detained them. Most of those arrested never had a chance to stand trial, and others were executed, tortured, or simply disappeared. He also outlawed labor unions and all political parties other than his own. The CIA-backed coup in Guatemala set off decades of civil war and unrest in the region that cost countless people their lives. U.S. President Bill Clinton apologized to Guatemala for the atrocities committed by the dictators that the CIA and the U.S. government helped install, but the damage was already done. In 1954, the Guatemalan coup was not the first time that the CIA helped overthrow a democratically elected leader in another country, and it would not be the last. But it was one of the most disastrous. The CIA did not just deliberately interfere in foreign politics, they targeted domestic groups as well. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson requested that the CIA begin an operation to investigate and target political dissidents in the United States through a collection of projects, including Project Merrimack, which infiltrated domestic anti-war organizations, and Project Resistance, which worked with college administrators, campus security, and local police to identify and target anti-war activists. In 1969, when Nixon came into office, these various projects were consolidated into Operation Chaos. Using a combination of information, electronic eavesdropping, and physical surveillance, the CIA infiltrated and spied on groups that were opposed to the Vietnam War. They also targeted social justice and leftist groups with no connection to the war, including Women's Strike for Peace, Students for a Democratic Society, the Black Panther Party, and the Young Lords. In 1972, the Watergate scandal and the involvement of two former CIA operatives in the break-in drew a great deal of negative attention to the CIA. Nixon fired CIA Director Helms amidst the scandal, and Operation Chaos was no more. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh exposed the operation in a New York Times article. The program's revelation resulted in the formation of the Commission on CIA Activities within the United States. One of the most infamous and mysterious CIA projects of all time involves a concerning cocktail of human experimentation, mind control, and psychedelic drugs. That's right, we can't discuss CIA scandals without talking about MKUltra. In the 1940s, the Office of Strategic Services became increasingly interested in the potential use of drugs for interrogation purposes. In 1947, Project Chatter was initiated, and the first tests of LSD on human subjects were conducted. Next came Project Artichoke, which was intended to determine whether drugs could be used to make a person involuntarily attempt an assassination. Some of the drugs given to unknowing CIA agents include morphine, mescaline, and LSD. Then, in the early 1950s, American POWs began to return from the Korean War in a state of apparent brainwashing. Allen Dulles, who should be a familiar name by now, gave a speech on April 10, 1953, in which he expressed grave concern over the battle for men's minds, or as he called it, brain warfare. One of the reasons for this, he said, was because doing non-consensual experiments on men's minds was against core American and human values. But 3 days later, Dulles approved the start of MKUltra. MKUltra encompassed a wide variety of experiments on mind control and behavior modification, and included the use of shock therapy, hypnosis, radiation, and a wide variety of drugs and other chemical compounds. There were, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, 162 different projects indirectly financed by the CIA that fell under the umbrella of MKUltra. Some of the test subjects volunteered, others were coerced into participation, and others were given little to no information on the nature of the experiments that they were participating in. For example, a group of mentally disabled students at a state school were given radioactive oatmeal without their knowledge. Other groups subjected to non-consensual testing included prisoners, sex workers, and cancer patients. In the words of Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who introduced LSD to the CIA, these were people who could not fight back. In one experiment in Lexington, Kentucky, 7 prisoners were given multiple doses of LSD for 77 days straight. In another experiment, North Korean prisoners were dosed with depressant drugs, then stimulants, and then exposed to heat and electric shocks. In 1957, former organized crime boss Whitey Bulger was one of the inmates subject to MKUltra testing. He described his experience being allegedly injected with LSD at the behest of the CIA. 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, total loss of appetite, hallucinating. The room would change shape, hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls, guys turning into skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. The CIA did not just test LSD on inmates and other marginalized people. They often dosed their fellow CIA employees without their knowledge. One of these men was Frank Olson. On Thursday, the 19th of November, 1953, Olson was drugged with what he was told was a potential truth serum, later revealed to be LSD. When he returned home to his wife in Maryland, he told her that he had made a terrible mistake. He expressed misgivings about the work that the agency was doing and about his role in that work. Olson was disoriented and agitated over the next several days and was sent home from work with an escort, claiming that they worried he was a threat to himself and others. At that point, he agreed to submit to psychiatric treatment. Then, at around 2 a.m. on Saturday, November 28, 1953, Olson fell to his death on the sidewalk in front of the Statler Hilton Hotel. He died before medical help could reach the scene. In 2012, Olson's son sued the federal government for the wrongful death of their father. Eric Olson stated, "The evidence shows that our father was killed in their custody. They have lied to us ever since, withholding documents and information and changing their story when convenient." Though the exact nature of Olson's death has been described as an accident and murder by various parties, his death is inextricably linked to MKUltra. The Olsons are not the only family members who can sue over MKUltra. The relatives of other test subjects attempted to file a class action lawsuit against the U.S. government for its role in brainwashing experiments conducted at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute. Unfortunately for them, the court ruled that the United States government could not be tried in Canada. Another infamous MKUltra project was Operation Midnight Climax. At 225 Chestnut Street, San Francisco, California, Agent George White had a bedroom renovated, decorated with red curtains and framed French artwork, bugging equipment, and a two-way mirror. There, sex workers would lure men into the room who would then be dosed with LSD so that White could observe their behavior. White later described his motives for these experiments in a less than savory way. "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, abuse, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" The MKUltra experiments continued until the spring of 1963, when John Vance, a member of the CIA Inspector General staff, learned about the use of non-voluntary human subjects in the project. The Inspector General insisted on new ethics guidelines for the agency's research and an end to the use of non-consenting subjects. A 1975-76 Senate hearing concluded that the project was a violation of human rights, stating, "The research and development program, and particularly the covert testing programs, resulted in massive abridgments of the rights of American citizens, sometimes with tragic consequences. The deaths of 2 Americans can be attributed to these programs. Other participants in the testing programs may still suffer from the residual effects." The committee continued saying, "The nature of the tests, their scale, and the fact that they continued for years after the danger of surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting individuals was known to demonstrate a fundamental disregard for the value of human life. However, a limited number of inquiries could be conducted into MKUltra." See, in 1973, as more attention began to focus on the programs, the director of MKUltra told workers to destroy the MKUltra files. They claimed it was out of concern for participants' privacy and potential embarrassment. But whatever the real motive was, the paper records were largely purged. Though large swaths of it have been uncovered, many of MKUltra's secrets will stay forever buried. In the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks, the CIA conducted interrogations at a variety of detention sites known as black sites. In 2014, a report by the Senate Intelligence Committee revealed that the so-called interrogations conducted at these sites consisted of torture so brutal and inhumane that many agency employees suffered emotional breakdowns just from witnessing them. The undertaking was not just inhumane, but poorly planned and cloaked in deceit, often involving blatant lies to Congress, the State Department, and even the White House itself. The executive summary of the report included descriptions of one detention facility, referred to as Cobalt in the report. Conditions at CIA detention sites were poor and were especially bleak early in the program. CIA detainees at the Cobalt detention facility were kept in complete darkness and constantly shackled in isolated cells with loud noise or music, and only a bucket to use for human waste. Lack of heat at the facility likely contributed to the death of a detainee. The chief of interrogations described Cobalt as a dungeon. Another senior CIA officer stated that Cobalt was itself an enhanced interrogation technique. At times, the detainees at Cobalt walked around naked or were shackled with their hands above their heads for extended periods of time. Other times, the detainees at Cobalt were subjected to what was described as a rough takedown, in which approximately 5 CIA officers would scream at the detainee, drag him outside of his cell, cut his clothes off, and secure him with mylar tape. The detainee would then be hooded and dragged up and down a long corridor while being slapped and punched. A U.S. military legal advisor who visited the site in November 2002 observed the treatment of Rida al-Najjar, a former bodyguard of Osama bin Laden and the first detainee at Cobalt. His experience was described in the report. The U.S. military officer also noted that the junior CIA officer designated as warden of the facility has little to no experience with interrogating or handling prisoners. Concerning al-Najjar specifically, the legal advisor indicated that the CIA's interrogation plan included isolation in total darkness, lowering the quality of his food, keeping him at an uncomfortable temperature, cold, playing music 24 hours a day, and keeping him shackled and hooded. In addition, al-Najjar was described as having been left hanging, which involved handcuffing one or both wrists to an overhead bar that would not allow him to lower his arms for 22 hours each day for 2 consecutive days in order to, quote, break his resistance. It was also noted that al-Najjar was wearing a diaper and had no access to toilet facilities. According to the CIA Inspector General, the detention and interrogation of Rida al-Najjar became the model for handling other detainees at detention site Cobalt. The report also detailed the treatment of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, referred to by the abbreviation KSM. According to CIA records, interrogators began using the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques at detention site Cobalt a few minutes after the questioning of KSM began. It stated KSM was subjected to facial and abdominal slaps, the facial grab, stress positions, standing sleep deprivation with his hands at or above head level, nudity, and water dousing. In addition, the chief of interrogations at Cobalt also ordered the rectal rehydration of KSM without determination of medical need, a procedure that the chief of interrogations would later characterize as illustrative of the interrogator's total control over the detainee. The conditions at these detention sites seemed uniquely horrible, even by federal prison standards. According to an anonymous CIA officer quoted in the report, Federal Bureau of Prison staff who visited detention site Cobalt were wowed because they have never been in a facility where individuals are so sensory deprived, i.e. constant white noise, no talking, everyone in the dark, with the guards wearing a light on their head when they collected and escorted a detainee to an interrogation cell, detainees constantly being shackled to the wall or the floor, and the starkness of each cell, concrete and bars. There's nothing like this in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Some agency employees were horrified by what they witnessed, and one agency employee wrote at the time that several on the team were profoundly affected, some to the point of tears and choking up. Others were less impacted, such as an interrogator whose email was obtained by the Senate committee. The email described the enhanced interrogation of KSM, saying, "He did vomit a couple of times during the waterboard with some beans and rice. It's been 10 hours since he ate, so this is surprising and disturbing. We plan to only feed Ensure for a while now. I'm heading back for another waterboard session." Speaking of waterboarding, the committee study included a CIA photograph of a waterboard at detention site Cobalt, including the device itself, buckets, a bottle of unknown pink solution, and a watering can. This contrasts with the fact that there was no confirmed waterboarding at the site. In a meeting between the committee staff and CIA officials in the summer of 2013, the officials were unable to explain the photograph or what the waterboard was doing at a facility that supposedly had no waterboarding on site. This was the only case where the facts in the official agency report did not appear to line up. In 2007, in a closed-door session with the Senate panel, then CIA Director Hayden testified, "In the history of the program, we've had 97 detainees." This was incorrect. According to the report, the number was actually 119. 2 years after the session, a subordinate reported that Hayden instructed them to keep the detainee number at 98. In a briefing for senior aides to President Obama, he wrote to himself in an email describing his orders to pick whatever date I needed to make that happen, but the number is 98. The report includes additional cases in which the CIA officials allegedly hid facts about the program. In 2003, Vice President Dick Cheney's lawyer, David Addington, asked whether the CIA had videotaped interrogations of Abu Zubaydah. CIA General Counsel Scott Mueller told agency colleagues that he had said that tapes were not being made. However, the CIA had, in fact, recorded dozens of their interrogation sessions. These tapes were destroyed in 2005, prompting an investigation by the Justice Department. A 21-hour section of the recordings, which did include the waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah, had gone missing years prior when John Helgerson, the then CIA Inspector General, and his office attempted to review them. The Senate report also scrutinized and called into question the notion that the interrogation program produced any intelligence helping to thwart or capture al-Qaeda operatives that could not have been attained through other means. For example, the CIA credited the interrogation program for aiding in the capture of Hambaldi, a senior member of the militant group Jemaah Islamiyah. They claimed the information that had led to his capture was acquired during the interrogation of KSM. However, according to findings by the Senate committee, no information from KSM played a role in this capture. His capture was achieved via signals intelligence, Thai authorities' investigations, and a CIA source. The CIA objected to the claims made in the Senate report, but the over 500 pages of evidence compiled within are pretty hard to dispute. Whether it could be justified or not for its role in the war on terror, torture of prisoners, and the deliberate obfuscation of the truth about that torture did take place. Going back to September 11, 1973, a coup overthrew the Marxist president of Chile, Salvador Allende. In his place, the dictator Augusto Pinochet assumed power and began an era of horrific human rights violations in the country. The CIA may not have directly funded this coup, but it did support the overthrow of Allende, and the agency has since tried to cover up its knowledge of the coup before it occurred. Though the precise extent of the agency's involvement is somewhat obscured, thanks to the censorship of official documents, the agency has acknowledged ties to members of the Chilean military who plotted the coup. In September 2000, a special report on its operations in Chile to the House Intelligence Committee, the CIA stated that at the time of the coup, it was aware of coup plotting by the military and had ongoing intelligence collection relationships with some plotters. And because the CIA did not discourage the takeover and had sought to instigate a coup in 1970, probably appeared to condone it. Once Pinochet assumed power, he behaved similarly to previous South American dictators installed with CIA backing. He outlawed opposing political parties, shut down universities, and began to detain and disappear political opponents by the thousands. Joe Eldridge, an American human rights advocate who was in Chile at the time with the United Methodist Church, described the aftermath of the coup. People were disappearing right and left from my neighborhood. Friends of mine were disappearing, and I was afraid I was going to disappear. The morgue was filled. Bodies were floating down the Mapocho River. In 1974, Seymour Hersh of the New York Times exposed the CIA ties to the coup, writing about the $8 million campaign against Allende that the agency funded from 1970 to 1973. One particularly notable CIA project was the funding of El Mercurio, a Santiago area newspaper strongly opposed to Allende. The CIA gave the paper at least $1.5 million in funding, endorsing its anti-Allende bent. Although this was not the first time the CIA and the US government had interfered in another nation's government or backed a coup directly or indirectly. The 1973 coup attracted a unique amount of attention. Pinochet's government was so blatant, so violent, and was enacting that violence at such a socially volatile time that it attracted unprecedented attention. The US was, in the words of Peter Kornblue of the Chile Documentation Project at the National Security Archive, caught red-handed. As World War II was drawing to an end, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency and the Office of Strategic Services, the organization that would eventually become the CIA, began Operation Paperclip. The operation's goals were to find and take German weaponry and other technological advancements for United States use. The weaponry alone was not enough, and the operation soon expanded to include the German scientists themselves, whom the authorities would recruit and bring to the US. They wanted to keep the German research out of Soviet hands by any means necessary. President Harry Truman signed off on the operation, but was concerned about the agency recruiting scientists with Nazi ties. The JIOA and OSS got around this by destroying or hiding evidence of war crimes from the records of these scientists, even those with explicit ties to the Nazi regime. In her book, Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America, writer Annie Jacobsen detailed the more insidious side of this operation and the cover-ups involved. One prominent example from Jacobsen's book is Wernher von Braun, who was brought to the United States as a part of Operation Paperclip and became an instrumental figure in the United States space program and the early days of NASA. Contrary to what the OSS, JIOA, and the Pentagon would obfuscate, von Braun was a Nazi and a member of the SS as well. He even handpicked slave labor for the facility where his rockets were built in Germany, collecting workers from the Buchenwald concentration camp. Another scientist brought over as part of Operation Paperclip was Dr. Theodore Benzinger, who invented the ear thermometer and worked with the US military. He also worked closely with Heinrich Himmler during the war, worked in concentration camps, and was on the original list of Nuremberg war crimes trials. He died in 1999, and his New York Times obituary remembered him only as an ally of the US military, whitewashing any of his war crimes. Another example was Otto Ambros, a German chemist who was convicted of war crimes but still granted admission into the U.S. via Operation Paperclip-affiliated projects. In the 1950s, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, recruited former Nazis as intelligence assets in the Cold War fight against the Soviet Union. He believed in the potential use of, his words, moderate Nazis for this purpose. He recruited many of these men himself and even shielded them from accusations of involvement with the Nazi war crimes. Some historians, such as Erich Lichtblau, author of The Nazis Next Door: How America Became a Safe Haven for Hitler's Men, have blamed Dulles for protecting General Karl Wolff from facing war crimes charges at Nuremberg. Wolff was Himmler's ex-chief of staff and had met extensively with Dulles for negotiations before his tenure as the first director of the CIA. In the 1970s, several hearings on Operation Paperclip in the U.S. House of Representatives reached the conclusion that the American military leaders had made morally bankrupt decisions for the sake of national security. In 1979, the Justice Department founded the Office of Special Investigations, intended to find and prosecute Nazi war criminals in the U.S. However, the OSI never brought any of the scientists involved in Operation Paperclip to trial. There are few eras in modern American history with as much controversy attached as the Vietnam War. The first televised American war, Vietnam saw horrors and atrocities that many Americans could scarcely comprehend. One of these horrors was the CIA's Phoenix program, a program designed as a collaboration between the American, Australian, and South Vietnamese militaries that was, in the CIA's own words, a set of programs that sought to attack and destroy the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong. The program involved the collection of intelligence and the capture, interrogation, and killing of VC members. Rather than focusing on military operatives, the program focused on local police and local government militia. As journalist Douglas Valentine put it, central to Phoenix is the fact that it targeted civilians, not soldiers. The program conducted random searches and arrests of civilians. Those arrested were detained at interrogation centers, where officers practiced cruel methods of interrogation. Peter De Silva, the CIA station chief in Saigon, aimed to emulate the Viet Cong's brutality, and the methods employed in the program were undeniably severe. According to Valentine, interrogation techniques included physical assault, involving various forms of violence such as beatings with objects, electric shock, and simulated drowning, suspension, where a prisoner's arms were restrained behind them and they were hung from a ceiling hook before being subjected to further abuse, and the deployment of police dogs to intimidate and harm prisoners. The Phoenix program also carried out targeted assassinations of suspected Viet Cong members. Lieutenant Vincent Okamoto, an intelligence liaison officer for the Phoenix program in 1968, recounted the experience of seeking out targets. The problem was, how do you find the people on the blacklist? It's not like you had their address and telephone number. The normal procedure would be to go into a village and just grab someone and say, "Where's Nguyen so-and-so?" Half the time the people were afraid and they would not say anything. Then a Phoenix team would take the informant, put a sandbag over his head, poke out 2 holes so he could see, put common wire around his neck like a long leash, and walk him through the village and say, "When we go by Nguyen's house, scratch your head." Then that night Phoenix would come back, knock on the door and say, "April Fool's, mother effer." Whoever answered the door would get wasted. As far as they were concerned, whoever answered was a communist, including family members. Sometimes they'd come back to camp with ears to prove that they had killed people. Between 1968 and 1972, the Phoenix program neutralized, imprisoned, converted, or killed 81,740 suspected VC members. At least 26,000 of these were killed, though Seymour Hersh wrote that South Vietnamese official statistics indicated a death count closer to 41,000. According to investigative journalist Nick Turse, it was common for people to abuse the Phoenix program. For example, Vietnamese citizens would report their enemies as VC in order to have them killed. The program was officially shut down in 1972 following negative publicity, public outcry, and congressional hearings. From torture and cover-ups to meddling in international politics, collaborating with war criminals, and spying on U.S. citizens who committed no crime, the CIA has crossed the line dozens of times over the years. The worst part is that many of their operations are still classified, meaning that the CIA could have done much worse things, and we'd never know. Now check out 50 insane facts about the CIA you never knew, or watch this video instead.